Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Roundtable webinar on the Postcolonial Christianities in the Philippines 500 years and beyond. I am Miss Maylene Camino Maravilla, and I am honored to be your MC today. On behalf of the Theology and Religious Education Department and the Religious Educators Association of the Philippines, who organized this online event, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. We appreciate your time despite your busy schedules to join us today, and we hope that you'll learn a lot from us today. Before we proceed, I would like to remind you of some housekeeping rules for us to have a better experience in this online session. First, this session will be recorded for reference and stored in a DLSU Google Drive. Your name, profile photo, chat text, audio, and video data will be processed. Personal recordings through means other than those authorized by the university are prohibited to protect the privacy of the participants. Distribution of session recording through platforms aside from those authorized by the university are prohibited to protect personal data, and personal conversations unrelated to the session are discouraged in order to prevent authorized disclosure of personal data. So during the roundtable discussions, please feel free to post your questions or comments via Zoom's Q&A or the Threads Facebook page. So once again, good morning, and this session, our first roundtable discussion is focused on the indigenous practices and religion. So this is the first of the 7 roundtable conversations which examines the colonial, the neo-colonial, the dominant metropolitan interests that endured the cultural texts, the artifacts, practices of the Filipino Christianity. So the thrust of this roundtable is the constructive. So hence, welcoming the decolonization theologies and indigenization strategies that regard culture and dynamic um, contextualizations. So with this morning session will be attended by our guest speakers, Ferdinand Ano, Victoria Tauli Corpus, and Father Albert Alejo. Our moderator this day is Dr. Agnes Bazal. To start with our session this morning, may I invite each one to join us in prayer. May I call on Ms. Alma P. Sabulao, the faculty of the Theology and Religious Education Department, DLSU Manila.
Let us remember that we are in the most holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Our Creator God, thank you for the gift of 500 years of Christianity. Thank you for the gift of being our people, and for the gift of our land, our ecology. We pray, teach us and bind us in the most loving ways into each other and with the land and bodies of water and sky, in all their beauty and agonies. Open our senses for deeper listening and understanding of our indigenous brothers and sisters. Deep within, we remain indigenous after all, no matter how diverse we are. With our inspired indigenous minds, may we be led into deeper reconnections with the grounds of our faith, our culture in its ambivalences, and glorious dynamism for the sake of renewing life around us. Transgress our lives cheapened by violence, fragile but life cherished by your vision for us. With our indigenous minds, may we keep learning to promote justice, peace, compassion, respect, and solidarity with and for all the land dwellers, and that we keep acquiring the truth of beauty around us, revealing of your divine glory. Forgive us for our many failures to live love for each other and for the ecology, so that beyond 500 years, inspired by the courageous lives of witness faith before us, we move forward, trusting your love and your glory that will purify our minds, hearts, structures, systems to mirror your love incarnate. Let us pause to remember the soul of Sister Melanie Del Mundo of the Sisters of the Poor of St. Catherine of Siena and the faculty member of the LSU Theology and Religious Education Department, who served and witnessed faithfully her Christian faith.
Amen.
May she rest in peace. Amen. Saint John Baptist de la Salle, pray for us. Leave Jesus in our hearts
Forever.
forever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Miss Alma Sabulao, for that prayer. And indeed, let us pray for the repose of the soul of Sister Melanie Del Mundo. She has touched our lives and the students as well. So in line with this, we have to proceed to our session. We're gonna have the opening remarks by the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts of the De La Salle University, none other than Dr. Roderick Mancha.
Okay, can you hear me? To our distinguished speakers today, faculty and students of theology and religious studies, colleagues, guests, and friends, maalab na pagbati ng magandang umaga sa lahat. On this year, as we celebrate the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines, the College of Liberal Arts, specifically the Theology and Religious Education Department, takes the initiative to lead in hosting a series of roundtable discussions and conferences to revisit, rekindle, and interrogate the importance of Christian spiritual formation, tradition, and transformation that has shaped not only the Catholic faith, but our inter-religious engagements with other faiths and beliefs. As world religions have undergone radical shifts through the years since its inception or breakaway from dominant religious systems, this dialogue to situate post-colonial discourse/theory vis-a-vis Christianity is important in two ways. First, its value lies on critically evaluating how our faith coalesces with our personal aspirations to thrive, succeed, and grow ethically as a person and as Christians within a diverse nation/global community. And second, it directs us to position Christian religiosity and practices within our continuous mission to liberate it from its colonial moorings and to assert our identity, culture, and theology as part of a localized or contextualized duty to bring faith to the marginalized and the oppressed, the underrepresented or unrepresented individuals in our society. The first one I mentioned, I would say, is making the word Christianity holistically meaningful to a person. The second thing I spoke about earlier, meanwhile, talks about our mission to make it work or real or to actualize it as an ingredient to freedom, equality, and duty. I would like to personally extend my gratitude and appreciation to Dr. Albert Alejo, whose seminal work, Tao Po, Tuloy, has become an essential reading in my intellectual awakening as a Filipino scholar. To Dr. Ferdinand Ano of the Union Theological Seminary, which brings me back memory lane how the UTS library in PCU Dasmariñas became my sanctuary or I would say my own personal library when I was attending high school way back then in PCU. And to Ms. Victoria Corpus, UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, who is going to discuss an equally important topic about the indigenous practices, religions, and human rights of our IPs. I am excited and can't wait to hear and learn from our distinguished speakers today. On behalf of the administration and faculty of CLA, I warmly welcome you to De La Salle University. We are grateful to you for gracing this morning's roundtable discussion. To the entire faculty members of the Theology and Religious Education Department, the chair, Dr. Pides del Castillo, and her predecessor, Dr. Agnes Basal, I wish to congratulate you for spearheading this year-long series of activities. Despite the current pandemic crisis, TRED's commitment to pursue excellence and vigor in research and academics does not wane. Congratulations to everyone, and may you continue to prosper and grow together in mission with Saint LaSalle. Let me end my opening remarks by citing a Filipino theologian, one who is highly respected and admired by his colleagues, and who has become remarkably influential together with other Filipino scholars in laying the grounds for the indigenization of Filipino theology and spirituality. Our late Dr. Jose M. de Mesa says, and I quote, "There is no theology except contextual theology. Contextual is synonymous to enculturated or local. I don't exactly remember when I became that we can have a Filipino theology, a theology not far from home. For sure, the ferment of nationalism is a factor in my development. I became aware of how miseducated I was. It's a personal crisis in that we were overwhelmed by Western theology and we could not think our own thoughts. How could we? Then I need to imagine a genuinely Filipino theology, not just a translation of the theology of the West." End of quote from Introduction, Jose M. de Mesa, in conversation with David Jonathan Bayot, page 4. Muli, mapagpala at magandang umaga po sa ating lahat.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nuncio, for that opening remarks. And our session this morning will be moderated by none other than Dr. Agnes Embrazal, faculty, and as well as a special or expert in this field of indigenous practices. Let's all welcome Dr. Agnes Embrazal.
Magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. In this roundtable series, we are examining the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines through the specific lens of postcolonial theory. Now, what is postcolonial theory? Postcolonial theory interrogates or questions the political, aesthetic, economic, historical, and social impact of European colonial rule from the age of conquest to modernity. As a system of literary and cultural analysis, postcolonial theory has roots in the publication of Edward Said's Orientalism in 1978. For Said, Orientalism demonstrates how every branch of knowledge is part and parcel of European hegemony through the process of colonial conquest and domination. Colonialism has not really ended, but persists in other structures of domination today. In short, the world we inhabit can only be understood through imperialism and the worldview of enduring post-coloniality. The post suggests more a desire to go beyond the colonial in all its manifestations as expressed in various forms of resistance in the past and the present. In the Philippines, the post-colonial condition is defined largely, although not exclusively, through the lens of the Spanish Catholic imperial project. When we think of Filipino culture, we almost always conceive of practices that are fundamentally religious and colonial in sensibility. There is therefore an inevitable correlation between the study of history theological language and political practice. This morning, we embark on a series of roundtable discussions that illuminate the complex narratives that gave birth to our sense of identities and nationhood. In commemorating 500 years of Christianity, we not only take account of our history, but more importantly, seek to critically and creatively reimagine theological language in ways that deepen and expand our understanding of what it means to be Filipino Christian today. Our first roundtable discussion focuses on indigenous practices and religion. Now, who do we consider as a member of an indigenous group? The United Nations approach to identifying who is an indigenous is based on the following. 1, self-identification of an individual that in turn is validated by the community. 2, historical cultural link with pre-colonial societies. 3, attachment to a land and its natural resources. 4, distinctive culture as compared to the dominant social groups. And 5, intent to preserve their ancestral land and culture as an ethnic group. In the Philippine definition, it is further specified that IPs include their descendants who have retained their distinctive culture but have been displaced from their ancestral land or resettled in other places. So our RTD will have 3 parts: the individual presentations, followed by a moderated conversation among the panelists, and finally, the open forum. To start the RTD is our first paper presenter, Ferdinand Amang Ano, or Apo Ferdi. Apo Ferdi is a Bago Igorot from Sudipen, La Union. He holds a doctor's degree in theology and religious studies from the University of Leeds, England, teaches worship and religious studies at the Union Theological Seminary, Philippines, and serves concurrently as director of the seminary's Doctor of Ministry program. A clergy member of the United Church of Christ in the Philippines, he has served parishes in the southwestern fringes of the Cordillera region. His publications include articles on the Bago Igorot origins and the New World, IP Vision of Peace based on justice, and indigenizing worship. Let us give Apo Ferdi a warm welcome.
Isa pong maalab na pagbate sa inyong lahat. Naririnig niyo po ako? Maalab po na pagbate sa mga nakikita at hindi nakikita. Mag-share lang po ako. Yung sa Dr. Willard. Mag-share lang po ako.
Yes, Doc Michael?
It's parang kwento eh. It's like host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay na po, Apo.
Okay. Thank you. Nakikita na po sa screen?
Oo, nakikita na,
Okay.
nakikita.
Thank you. Siguro hindi natin na-miss yung balita last April na na-lift na ang ban sa mga bagong mining deals. This came directly from the President. Ano po? At saka, hindi nalingid sa atin ang revival ng Marcos era Chico River Basin Development Project. Na-revive na po yan under the Build program of the present government. At saka yun pong bago ngayon sa Apayao, sa Kalanasan River. Ito yung Gined 1 and 2 hydroelectric power project. At ito ay nangyayari sa panahon na tayo ay nasa pandemya. Ano po? And magandang bisitahin natin yan at maganda rin tingnan natin sa inyong mga napunta na sa Cordillera o mga taga-Cordi dyan o yung nakapag-immersion na sa Cordillera, siguro nasaksihan na ninyo ito, no? That whenever the Igorots as a community, gather as a community, they make it a point to plant or install a pudong at the vicinity or at the entrance of the gathering place. And when we say pudong, ito po yung isang grass variety, yung runo. Ano? Binabandal po yan, tapos in-install, tinatali sa poste or plant sa ground. Now, ngayon, paano natin intindihin ang ritual na ito? Is this something unconnected to what I call as the clear and present danger to the earth and all that dwell therein? So yun po ang tanong. Now, the planting of the pudong is accompanied by prayers, bidding everyone, both seen and unseen, to look after the house gardens, Sweden farms, livestock, properties, and all that the villagers live for the gathering. The standing pudong gives the assurance that all dwellings are under divine protection and that no property will be violated throughout the ritual performance. And any infringements on those under the watch of Kabunyan, and we've heard that from the song sang ni kanina, no? Yung chant. That any infringements on those under the watch of Kabunyan are to suffer the wrath of the spirits. The pudong sticks also provide the passageway through which the ancestral spirits come by to commune with the living. It is this communion with the living communion of the living, the ancestral spirits, the earth and all that dwells therein, that calls on people and every living being to observe a solemn pause from whatever activity or work they are doing. So when the pudong sticks are standing, the whole earth and all of life rest. So to reintroduce the pudong in the context of the continuing development aggression that is affecting our indigenous communities in the Cordillera region may be significant in the development of spirituality of resistance among Igorots. And I have at least 4 propositions to share on this pudong spirituality. Now, when we plant the pudong, we declare the land and all that dwell therein as holy. And when we declare things as holy, we stand in awe of them. We are duty-bound to be reverential about them. We preserve them in their original and pristine forms as much as possible. We preserve and protect them. We live in harmony with them, celebrate their power, and feast around their good graces and blessings, while at the same time seeking restitution and balance whenever we offend them. So when colonial Christianity came and declared that Kadaklan or Kabunyan is not in charge anymore, and that there is this one true God who owns everything, and that this God is known only through Christianity, via Christianity, everything was disenchanted and desacralized. The land effectively became a mere resource for humanity to exploit, for humanity's flourishing. Christianity's radical monotheism, in other words, contributed to the eventual rape of Gran Cordillera. Secondly, When we plant the pudong, we call on people to become a community again. The pudong signals a movement from separation to communion. It designates time and space for communal activity separate from the villagers' daily engagements with, like farm work, domestic chores, and others. The occasion calls for communion, sharing, and the healing of relationships. When knotted and stuck on the ground, the pudong calls on the people to come together as a sin pangili, a community where social differentiation is set aside. Moreover, the Igorot believed that the pudong sticks are a gateway through which ancestral spirits come by to join the gathering of the living. The pudong thus further pushes the expanse of people's understanding of what it means to be a community. In this ritual, all creatures are reminded of their sharing the land and this life with ancestral spirits, and that the living have to relate with them in filial reverence. The pudong rite declares that community bond is stronger than the enticements of correct religion, money, and power, and that indigenous communities can be united in solidarity in upholding the rights to their ancestral lands and self-determination. The contemporary politics of development divide. Using patronage politics, the developmentalists breed its partisans from among the indigenous population, marginalize the voice of many, and try to undermine indigenous political processes. And through colonial institutions like churches, schools, and the government, big business has gone into cultural re-engineering programs designed to destroy the community's resistance. And these include Christian religious education and spiritual formation, and allied programs aimed at erasing the Igorot's indigenous memory and identity. These cultural Trojan horses were aimed at disorienting people away from their indigeneity and spirituality toward submission. Big business intends to employ cultural and political barriers to foil various community attempts to come together in a pan-Cordilleran commune, like how the present government now is doing with the Lumads of Mindanao. The National Commission on Indigenous Peoples is now actively campaigning for the de-Igorotization of the Cordillera people. Practiced almost everywhere in the mountain region, the planting of the pudong may be saying that the kaigurutan is one, and that our security lies not in those whose agenda is to harm and sever our culto-spiritual relationship with the earth, but in the religious and proper observance of the rites of radical connectivity with the earth. Thirdly, when we plant the pudong, we re-sacralize the profaned earth. The pudong bundle lays claim to all the surrounding spaces and declare them holy. The land to the Igorot is inherently sacred, and ritual performances like the pudong are occasions for the public affirmation of this reality. But given the current state of Igorot lands, the ritual appears to have lost its meaning and power. The Igorot's ancestral lands, like those of the open pit mining, ravaged mountains of Itugon, seem to have lost their aura of divinity. The rivers that used to be sources of freshwater fish are now deposits of mine tailings. The bare mountains and drying rivers were effectively disenchanted, and that the gods and spirits have been derobed of their mystical forest cover. The act of planting the pudong reclaims and celebrates the reality of a cultic relationship between the earth and her tillers, a relationship of mutual care, a mutuality designed to sustain life, and insofar as the local priests are concerned, a relationship designed in the very mind of divinity. The current neoliberal order calls for an economy that relies heavily on the wanton exploitation of the earth and its resources. It is thus necessary for big corporations, bureaucrats, and their cultural agents to manufacture people's consent, to use the word of the phrase or line of Noam Chomsky. By all means, including fascist repression and militarization. Mambiki is very familiar with this one. Cultural agencies, including religious groups, are being co-opted in this social project of manufacturing consent and softening people's resistance. Christian revivalism, with its American frontier, "This world is not my home" gospel, has been negating and disenchanting the non-human environment, while at the same time, with the stroke of genius, tapping into indigenous people's primal spirituality to sell itself as a religious alternative. In this light, to plant the pudong in a rite is to declare as living and pulsating the faith affirmation that the earth is sacred and that it is kabunyans and the spirits, not simply anyone's property to trespass and exploit as one pleases. The mountains, to use Hebraic scriptural language, are where bushes burn. They reveal the face of divinity and they call for sandals to be taken off. The pudong cries out, "Stay off the sacred." Now, lastly, the pudong ritual calls for a jubilee for the earth and all that dwell therein. In Igorot cosmology, the land is a living creative organism that shares the biological characteristics of other living creatures. If the human, the water buffalo, and other work animals tire, so does the land. The earth needs rest, and so do its tillers. Even the gods and spirits need rest. In other words, the pudong calls for the relief of the land in all that dwell therein. In the case of Northern Kankanais or Ifontoks, Tengao or the Tingians Ubaya, the planting of the pudong signals the beginning of Sabbath for everyone and every creature. The call to rest is so thorough that no one is allowed entry to or exit from the village throughout the Tengao. This is cultus, mutual care, at its highest symbolic form. Again, not unlike the ancient Hebrews who were summoned time and again by their judges and prophets to reorder their lives according to their cultus, the Igorot's reason for being takes its cues from the people's cultus. The Tengao calls for the resting of the land. It is incumbent upon the tiller to ensure that the land is at rest. This is the Igorot's part in its cultic relationship with the land. The pudong serves to remind the Igorot tillers of their part in that covenant. The whole Grand Cordillera chain of mountains is already partitioned by applications from multinational corporations involved in large-scale mining, logging, hydroelectric, coal and geothermal, pharmaceutical, and other extractive industries. The Mining Act of 1995 further intensified development aggression, leaving the mountains and their tillers without a real experience of rest. One story among the Amburayan Kankanais, otherwise known as Bago Igorots, or the Lipanto Amburayan Igorots, says that the continuous denuding of their mountain abodes made the gods and spirits flee, leaving their balding mountains devoid of divine presence. This was part actually of the research of Apo Florentino Hornedo among the Bago people in the western fringes of the Cordillera. As a result, the lands and communities living under the shadows of these mountains have been left unprotected by the gods and spirits. This state of abandonment effectively sentenced the papatayans or the sacrificial tables, altars of the foothills to their death. When the gods and the spirits have flown, The altars lay idle, and the religion and culture surrounding them die. So finally, I propose that our reflections during the commemoration of the 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines should include the following. Number one, Christianization's contribution to the marginalization of indigenous peoples, their spiritualities, and their ways of living. Number two, Christianization's contribution to the plunder and desecration of indigenous peoples' ancestral lands. And number three, to ask the question, how can Christianization or Christianity be a companion to indigenous peoples in their continuing struggle for national identity, self-determination, and in their struggle as guardians of the Cordillera's last frontiers. Maraming salamat po sa lahat.
Maraming salamat, Apo Ferdi. Okay, our second speaker is Albert Alejo of the Society of Jesus, also known as Paring Bert. He holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies and an MA degree in theology, philosophy, and social anthropology. He is also a poet and a lyricist. He has done research on indigenous peoples in relation to peace and development, not only in Mindanao, but also in Subic and Clark. Among his notable publications on IPs are his book, Generating Energies in Mount Apo, and the articles From Zamboanga to Subic and Clark, Conflict and Cooperation in Ancestral Domains and Economic Zones. Peace Talk, IPRA itself is a peace agreement, and on indigenous peoples in the Bangsamoro. He is co-founder of Aguila, Apo Governance and Indigenous Leadership Academy, in partnership with the Tagabawa Bagobo tribe in Makilala, Cotabato, and with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples and Development Academy of the Philippines. Let us all welcome Paring Bert.
Hello. Ako na ba? Ako pala. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, I want to maximize this. It's not maximized, so. Here.
This one, you can
Okay.
pick this.
Yeah, so I'll try to, thank you very much for the invitation. At saka Apo Ferdi, tamang-tama ito. Feeling guilty tuloy bilang pare, no? So just some personal notes, learning my involvement with indigenous peoples, witnessing ito, dalawang tribal groups na nag-aawa. And siyempre mayroong mamamatay na baboy dyan. And struggling with the IPs inside Bangsamoro. And sometimes we have to go to faraway places and be protected. And of course, in this situation, I'm a Jesuit, and there are missionaries in Mindanao and in other parts of the country. So the question is, okay, there have been, I think we need to reflect on that, especially John Paul II, 2 decades ago, said, we're sorry. John Paul II, March 12, 2000, he knelt down before the cross and uttered prayers. Lord, sorry, you ask us to love our enemies, to do good to those who hate us, and yet and peoples, and shown contempt for their cultures and religious traditions. So be patient and merciful toward us and grant us your forgiveness. So no less than the Pope himself said sorry. Actually, he was not the first one. The Canadian Oblates in 1991 said, "We apologize for the part we played in the cultural, ethnic, linguistic, religious imperialism that was part of the mentality within which the peoples of Europe first met Aboriginal peoples in Canada." And so we were naively part of this mentality. We, the churches, were naively part of this mentality of power. And not just part, were in fact often a key player in its implementation. Even the Anglican, sabi nung isang archbishop, sabi niya, I have felt shame and humiliation as I realized we have inflicted pain to the people. And sabi niya, I accept and I confess before God and you our failures in the residential schools. We are familiar with that. We failed you, we failed ourselves, and we failed God. There was a reconciliation walk in Europe following the route of the crusade. And the people along the way would say sorry for all the violence. The Jesuits in our document 1996 says, our intuition is that the gospel resonates with what is good in each culture. At the same time, we acknowledge that we have not always followed our intuition. Alam namin may maganda dyan pero may hindi lagi nasusunod, no? We have often contributed to the alienation of the very people we wanted to serve by imposing, for example, our language, our way of worshiping. Dito rin, mga Franciscan, sabi, we ask forgiveness of the Mayan people for not having understood your worldview and your religion. So we impose a religion you cannot really understand, and we destroyed a religion we did not even attempt to understand. So it's just a continuous misunderstanding and violent at that. So recently, I saw this article by Gaston Kibiton. I suppose he's from the Cordillera. So sabi niya, for a widespread impact on the church and the Christianized indigenous communities, the CBCP Assembly may do well to come up with a nationwide statement to be read out widely in all parishes. Wala pang ganyang statement ng apology. This can be done in a special liturgy of reconciliation, like the one presided over by Pope himself in 2000, or by the Australian Prime Minister. The church statement should go beyond asking for forgiveness and reconciliation. It should help in rectification of historical wrongs, and must also include an ambiguous statement recognizing that the indigenous peoples' religions and worldviews that the church tried to banish are not pagan, evil, or superstitious. Now, my point here is actually the bishops a decade ago have struggled to face the challenge of, saying sorry together with the Pope. Now, the Pope has said sorry. Sabi nila, should we also not say sorry? And that was a grueling experience. And
Wala ba si paring Bert?
Nawala po siya, Dr. Agnes.
Okay, we can give him time to re-enter.
All right. So while waiting for Paring Bird, I think as of the moment you have questions, so please keep them coming. For those who are here in the Zoom, you may have your questions via the Q&A portion, and then for those who are in the Facebook live, kindly have your questions posted there. Thank you. All right. So while waiting for Paring Bert Alejo to come back here in our session, there are some questions addressed to Dr. Ano. So I think it's fitting to ask now since we have ample of time. No? First question was from Mr. James Laksa. His question was the concept of the profaning of the earth existent in the original or ancient concept of pudong? Beside the ecological crisis or abuse, or are there other forms of profaning the earth within the pudong concept?
Well, actually, the context of my saying that was when I was in Isugon and I was attending a itungtungan among the Emili, a gathering, an assembly discussing the resistance to the open pit mines in their area. And when I saw one of those elders plant the pudong on a mound overlooking the open pit mine. And so that was like the immediate context of my saying that. No? Well, and it has to do, of course, with the profaning of the area. It used to be, they were telling about the stories of that river flowing through down, and that was affected by the open pit mines. So, and how, for example, and they showed how the mountains were really ravaged and desecrated. So it's like a kind of reading that is related to this immediate context. That's why I'm saying is this unconnected, right? Because when you plant that, means say that you have to really observe not only the presence of the spirits, but also to celebrate the sacredness of the earth. And now, again, in the context of development aggression, you can see all these violations against mountains, and so therefore, well, if you ask, for example, if you ask the elder, he would immediately say about the desecration of the grounds. And so now I did not dig deeper into that and to ask if, for example, in the original economy of the Pudong ritual, if indeed there is this kind of other acts of profaning the earth. So basically, that's where I'm coming from.
All right. So thank you for that, Dr. Ano. We still have a lot of questions, but I think we can take one more before Father Alejo. This question is from Mr. Jonathan Canete. His question was, is the belief of the IPs on the sacredness of the earth, especially of the ancestral land, does not form the symmetrical relationship with the Christian notion of the importance of sacredness of the earth?
Yeah, I'm talking about colonial Christianity, right? And the gospel of colonial Christianity. It's a entirely different thing when we go back to, of course, the biblical theology of the land. So this is primarily about colonial Christianity, how it was misinterpreted by colonial Christianity.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rizal.
maybe we can ask Miss Vicky to present first while we are waiting for Father Albert? So our third speaker for today is Miss Victoria Tauli Corpus, who served as the third UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples from 2014 to 2020. Ms. Tauli Corpus established and strengthened Indigenous peoples organizations such as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, Asian Indigenous Women's Network, the Global Partnership of Indigenous Peoples on Climate Change, Forest and Sustainable Development, and the Global Network on Extractive Industries and Indigenous Peoples. Ms. Tauli Corpus participated in the drafting of the UN Declaration on the Rights of IPs from 1985 until its adoption in 2007. From 2005 to 2009, she was the chairperson of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She is the founder and executive director of TEBTEBA, Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, an indigenous-led institution based in the Philippines, which engages actively in various global, regional, and national arenas to advocate for IP rights and development. Let us give Ms. Vicky Corpus a warm applause.
Okay, sorry. Okay. My video was disabled, but anyhow, I want to share a little PowerPoint. So I'll just, but it says the host disabled participant screen sharing. Can this be disabled so that it can be enabled so that I can share my PowerPoint?
It's already enabled for Dr. Corpus.
Oh, sige, okay. I'll just get the PowerPoint. Sorry for the. Okay, where is it? Oh yeah. It still says disabled. Oh, never mind. Never mind. I'll just show it later. But anyhow, I just wanted to thank the organizers, Agnes and others for organizing this meeting. I think this is really a great opportunity for us to revisit Christianity as it has affected our lives in our communities, and also and to think about what are the engagements that indigenous peoples had with churches, whether bad or good, and what are the prospects for future intercultural dialogues with the churches. I heard a bit, and I read the abstract of Reverend Ano, and I also heard a bit of what Father Albert Alejo has said. So I'll just build upon these things that they did. But I would like to start with a personal story. You know, I grew up in a Christian home. I'm the daughter of an Anglican priest. And although my parents are both indigenous, they are from Payo in Busao Mountain Province. And my father comes from the generation of the first missionaries educated by the Anglicans. And so he was a very passionate minister his whole life, and his whole passion is really how to convert, you know, us, our people, his relatives, his communities into Anglicanism. And so that's how we grew up. We are 10 in the family, and we were raised, you know, we transfer from one place to another. I was born in Baguio, but when I was 10 years old, we moved to our town in Busao, and so that was where I learned a lot about my own traditional systems and participated in many of the traditional rites and ceremonies. And I remember very clearly when we moved to Busao in 1962, my first cousin died. He was a teacher, and my father performed all the funeral events, the funeral rituals, and all, of course, in the Anglican tradition. But I have all my aunts and my relatives who still practice the indigenous spirituality. And when my cousin was being buried, there was a huge argument between my relatives and my father. And I recall that the main issue was my father refused my aunts to put all these ritual materials that usually goes to the coffin with the dead in his or her coffin. And my father said, no, you cannot do that. So later on, years after, I talked to my aunt, no, when my mother died, and they did the same thing. They brought all these materials, and I talked to my aunt and I said, "What did you do, by the way, when I was 10 years old? I remember very clearly that huge argument you had. And what did you do?" And then my aunt said, "Oh, your father thinks he is very bright, but actually after you all left, we went back and put back all the materials. And your father doesn't realize that it is not him who will suffer, it will be us, because we didn't do our obligation in terms of our respect for the dead." So that is a very, very classic example of what many children of priests and pastors go through, whenever there is this kind of conflict. And for me, having become an activist, and at an early age, I became an activist because I was in Manila during the first quarter storm. I was a scholar at the Philippine Science High School. And I became an activist, and many of us, my sister also was there, and I think 6 out of the 10 children all became activists fighting for indigenous people's rights. So we used to debate with our father, no? But since he is, I think that he understands, and he of course believes that he raised his kids very well, he really did try to see our point of view, and eventually he mellowed, and then he joined many of the priests who started to look into our own indigenous rituals as well as our prayers, and eventually, slowly, these are becoming part of the Anglican mass. No, but still, I'm not saying that it's still there, and there's still a lot of way to go. But I said this because when I learned about the traditions of my own people, I always go to my grandmother who practices this. And of course, I know the pudong very well, because when there is an ubaya or tungao, it is like a holiday that's declared by the ili, by the community. All of us have to follow that when they said there's an ubaya because there is a pestilence. Oh, I see Father Alejo. Maybe we should let Father Alejo continue before he goes off again. What do you think, Agnes?
Well, you can just finish and then we'll
Okay. So it's fine with you, Father? Okay.
Yeah, please. Saan ba ako nahinto?
Okay. Yeah, okay. So being raised in both settings, being an Anglican a priest's daughter and being indigenous was somewhat, and of course, and another identity, being a very staunch activist. I had to see how I can bring together all of these identities to and still be a whole person, and I did that. I learned a lot about my own the spirituality, which has been described very well, and you referred to this, Father, in Gaston Kibitan's article. And it's true, a lot of our spirituality is basically linked, to animism. Some people don't like that, but basically animism is a belief that links all living beings to spirits, no? And human beings, of course, have spirits. So we see ourselves as equal to other living beings. And we perform a lot of rituals and ceremonies to honor that relationship with other living beings, whether these are animals or plants, and also non-living beings. And we also to sites, no? So we have sacred mountains. This background that I have here is my town, and you can see that there's a mountain on top. That's Mount Bugao, that is considered the sacred mountain of the Ibusao, us, and we do go to do rituals also there, no? And that's where that's also some like a watershed also for our fields. But we do that every time when there is all the agricultural cycles. We do a bugnas to pray for a good harvest before we plant. When a house is being built, when there is a pandemic, an epidemic in the community, of course, for weddings, births, deaths, we have a ritual for everything, no? So basically, if you stay in the Ili, your life is really spent in a lot of these rituals, which I think is all not just important for sustaining and ensuring that our connection with the nature and the ecosystem around us remains. Our connection with the past, the present, in the future is also ensured. And that's I would like to say that I think that's one of the meaning of these rituals. It connects us to the past, to our ancestors. So the spirits of our ancestors are always invoked whenever we pray. Of course, the past, and the present, the present ecosystem, the spirits, the deities of the water, the springs, the spring waters. The spring waters are very sacred to us, and there are many taboos connected to how to take care of the spring waters. We are not allowed to be noisy when we are there because the spirits might get disturbed. We cannot throw garbage. We cannot use these shampoos or soap when we are in those areas, and we have to talk to them to help continue provide us healthy water and to water our plants. Our farmers always talk to their plants. Whenever we plant in the rice fields, that there is a little prayer, and they talk and they say, please be productive. They talk to the rice fields, and when you go and hunt, in the past we used to have boars, wild pigs, and so when they hunt, they also pray and ask permission from the animal when the animal is being butchered. So there's a lot of this is the kind of spirituality that I grew up with, and I find this very interesting compared, of course, to the masses that my father has. Although we go to mass every day, because that's what it entails. When you are the daughter of a priest, I have to go and ring the bells, the angelos, and all that. So I learned. So I also memorized a bit, the rituals of the church, because of course you go there every day. But I find my indigenous religious practices more interesting, and more exciting. So how does this affected me? Well, as you mentioned in my introduction, I became an activist, and one of the first fights I went through, which made me realize very much the need for indigenous rights, was the Chico River Dam struggle. I participated in some of the peace pact, the multilateral peace pact events that were held. I even hiked from Sagada down to Abra to participate. And then that's where we realized that there is really the need for a standard that will protect the rights of indigenous peoples. And that's also when I sort of question sometimes even the social movements, because they always look at indigenous peoples as like environmentalists and all that. And I said, but we do have rights. Even, of course, we care for the environment and we do have a close relationship with nature. But as indigenous peoples have collective rights to their lands, territories, and resources, a right to their culture, to their beliefs, and to their own languages, you have to also acknowledge those rights and not just simplify everything into a struggle against the dictatorship, a struggle against multinational corporations, etc. Those are all part of it, but you also have to recognize these rights, and the dominant society usually doesn't do that. And that's what compelled me to take part in the UN, because we didn't know there's even a thing called the UN Declaration on Human Rights. It was only when our ancestors, our leaders were being jailed and all that we started looking for justice, and that's where we thought that we can find body who can listen to us. And that's how it all started with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So I went through that whole process, and I must say that, my relationship with the church somehow improve a bit, because the churches, the Catholic Church was in fact one of the first church which supported the fight against Chico. If you remember, Father Claver, is a Jesuit. He was the one who has exposed this, linked us to many of these networks, and hosted a lot of the events where the indigenous leaders went to try to go to Malacanang to speak to Marcos, and also to write a letter to Robert McNamara, the president of the World Bank, among others. He has been very involved with it, and the church have been helping send their organizers to work in the communities which are protesting. So that has somehow changed the way I regard the church. And slowly the Anglican Church also started coming on board, and they started to talk about these struggles as well. So I think that much as I really didn't appreciate that kind of setting in my life, in the end I valued the role that the church has played. But this has really to go through a lot of dialogues, of course. And when we were negotiating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the World Council of Churches provided a space for us to bring together all the indigenous peoples all over the world to talk and agree upon ourselves on how what are the kinds of articles that we think are crucial to be part of the declaration, and of course for us to also have our cultural and do some of our rituals, indigenous rituals there. So that kind of dialogue with the church and partnership that we entered into gave me a very good sense of what the church can do, when it aligns itself with those who are marginalized and oppressed, And I remember during the dictatorship, I was working with Father Abisamis because he was giving these courses on the Bible in context, and that's where I also appreciated the need to also situate our theology within the specific cultural, social, and political context of the space where you are doing this, And I think the statement of Pope Francis recently in his Laudato Gaudium or something, he mentioned that the cultural context has to be borne in mind by theologians whenever they are making their theologies. And I think that's the point that was raised by both Reverend Anu and Father Alejo. How do we indigenize our theology? And I think that's a very big challenge, because it's really, the church is very rich, the church is really set on its own rituals, its own prayers. And the Anglican Church, we have our Book of Common Prayer, and really a prescribed set of prayers. Of course, now they translate it to the language, but I think that it's about time that they also change the content and recognize the spiritualities of other people who don't necessarily identify themselves as Christians. The kind of spirituality which recognizes your solidarity with all other creation, as well as with physical things, non-living things, and also that recognizes the past, the present, and the future, is really something that we need to put together. I always refer to the past, present, and the future because that's what indigenous ideology is. We always refer to the past. That's why we really give a lot of respect and reverence for our ancestors. Of course, the present is there, but the future is also very important. We always think of people 7 generations ahead of us. What are we going to leave as a legacy to indigenous peoples who will live 7 generations away? Can we live, and when we die, can we say that we did something that will allow these people to live a life with more justice, peace, and of course with better well-being? And that remains the challenge up to now. And the church, I can see that the church is also in that path to seek for ways of being relevant, in this very troubled world. And I'm a member of this interfaith initiative, on on climate change and forests. And I have been meeting a lot of religious people, not just from the Christian churches, but also from the Muslim, the Buddhist, and other faiths. And I think that's the way to go. This kind of interfaith coordination and collaboration is crucial for us to be able to have an additional element and weapon that we can use in our fight to bring about a better world. So I think I'd like to end there because I'd like to hear to Father Albert. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Miss Vicky. Paring Bert, I think you stopped with the quote from Gaston Quibiten, who incidentally was a former student of mine at Mary Hill School of Theology.
Yeah. Okay.
You're unmuted.
Pa-cute.
Okay.
All right. Okay, that was still a long way. Okay, now, so in other words, many people have already said sorry, no? Even before Pope John Paul II, who is now. And so when Gaston Quibiten says the church should say sorry, and he has many good examples of how to move forward, I say, well, let's go back to that moment when 60 bishops attended a workshop. And I was asked to help in facilitating it. And because that was the 10th anniversary of the prayer of pardon. And the idea was the purification of memory from all the scandals. So it called for collective self-examination of the church in the Philippines. But there were many questions. And some bishops were asking very basic questions. Wait a minute, sino ba yung mga IP? Paano sila naging iba sa atin? Ganyan, ano? Ilan ba sila? Ilan yung Katoliko? Hindi ba yung iba dyan mga Protestante na? O ba't hindi ba natin sila gagawin din Katoliko? Mga ganyan, ano? So are you saying, bibinyagan ba sila o hindi? May mga very practical pastoral questions. Sabi, ang problema, maraming hindi na pag-uusapan. Iba yung takbo ng parokya, iba yung takbo ng social action. Social action mas issue. Yung parokya, gusto binyagan lang yung mga IP. So kailangan mag-usap-usap. Tapos sabi nila, paano kami sa Metro Manila? Wala namang IP dito. Kailangan ba kami maging concerned dyan? Kailangan ng pondo. Magkano ba kailangan? So, magkano, no? So in the end, sabi ko, may very sensitive pala to. So I proposed a threefold question for the workshop. One, what can we reaffirm in the church's history of dealing with the IPs? Siguro naman, hindi naman na masasamang tao lahat yung mga misyonero na sumakay ng barko, walang uwian, yung iba dyan, di ba? Siguro naman, meron din silang ginawang mabuti. Second, what do we regret? So totoo lang din, marami talaga, no? And then what are we ready to do from now on? And so summary of the workshop results, reaffirm, sounds familiar. Work, witness, scholarship of the early missionaries. They compiled dictionaries, flora and fauna, without which we could not have some basis for our assertion of indigenous culture. Pastoral work, humanitarian work, when there are accidents and disasters, catechesis, involvement in the education, scholarships, kaya yung iba nakapag-aral din, ano? Collaboration with the laity and NGO. What do we regret? Sabi nila, well, we regret the fact that some missionaries, after so many years, still fail to understand the language, alienating. There's a loss of writing, discriminatory practices like imposing Espanol or English, especially with the Americans, failure to stress the social teachings of the church, lack of coordination among church ministries, paternalism, acquisition of lands, cultural exploitation. So what are we ready to do? So yung mga binabanggit nga kanina, totoo yun. So i-affirm din yun. Pero at the same time, kung gagawa rin ng ng bagong theology, hindi naman pwedeng puro yung masasamang ginawa. Kasi nagmumukhang inutil naman yung tribo na parang naging utu-utu lang sila. Hindi naman ganoon, di ba? Hindi naman lahat ng kinuha sa pwersa, merong mga pagkakatugma ng mga kultura at saka ng turo. So what are we ready to do? We need to revise our catechesis, our seminary formation. We need to establish IP desks. We need to institutionalize indigenous ministry work and put some money to it. Closer collaboration with the laity, the NGOs, and we need a new formation of the seminarians. If we cannot form the bishops at this point, but the overt preaching of Jesus continues. So maybe we should draft a pastoral letter. Did they write a pastoral letter? No. So nangyari, a few months after that, we had a national convention of the Episcopal Commission on Indigenous People. So ano pa rin ito, CBCP, pero it's just a commission together with the IP desk of the Association of Major Religious Superiors. And one prominent event there was the homily of Cardinal Vidal. Sabi niya, we need to learn evangelization without cultural violence. So we need to understand what culture is. Ganyan, in the rapidly globalizing world. So hindi naman po pwedeng basta leave them alone. Kasi Coca-Cola is already there. The armed groups are already there. The military are already there. So we cannot just say, leave them alone, don't touch them. Pero at saka at the same time, sabi niya, the gospel sometimes in other areas could also be a challenge to some cultural aberrations. Like yung mga incest, nandiyan pa rin yan. Human rights violation to girls. Minsan nandiyan pa rin yan. So hindi naman po pwedeng basta, kultura nila yan. No? So, hindi naman pwedeng gano'n. So itong discover niyang formula. We must not apologize for sharing Jesus Christ. We must ask forgiveness for failing to act like Jesus. We must not apologize for sharing with them the fruits of development like computers, education, but we must ask forgiveness for teaching them the ways of greed and selfishness. We must not apologize for making them members of the church if they want to, but we must ask forgiveness for the abuses of some of our leaders, including sexual harassment of the young. We must ask forgiveness for teaching Christianity as an ideology rather than a relationship with God. So it demands listening, and not just listening, but recognizing them as equals and partners. No? That means bringing good news is comparing notes. So what's your experience of God? And this is my experience of God, and Jesus Christ is part of that. Now, ang nangyari, hindi yung buong CBCP ang gumawa ng statement, kundi ang Episcopal Commission on Indigenous Peoples. At sabi dito, healing for solidarity, asking forgiveness for sins against Indigenous peoples, a humble examination of conscience toward the healing of historical wounds by asking pardon for sins committed against the Indigenous peoples. Ito ang maganda nito. We ask forgiveness for suppressing their spirit. Yan ang mabigat Mabigat yan Paanong babawiin yun? Hindi nakukuha yan sa scholarship. We ask forgiveness for moments when we entered indigenous communities from a position of power. We rode the colonial boat. We alighted from World Bank cars, etc. No? So we ask forgiveness for moments when we thought Christianity as a religion robed with colonial cultural superiority. Right. Ito, isa sa mga documents, nakikita yan halimbawa sa Jesuit, we have a document, the same general congregation. One document says interreligious dialogue, but it mentions Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism. Yung mga merong sacred book. And then, what about the indigenous peoples? They are in another chapter, which is inculturation. So sometimes very tricky to. very tricky. Sabi ko doon sa Bishops Ulama Conference sa Mindanao, bakit walang lumad doon sa Bishops Ulama? Ang sabi sa akin, kasi ayaw ng mga Muslim. Bakit daw? Kasi wala naman silang Biblia o Quran. So the presence, the possession of a sacred book could actually be used to discriminate against those who have a different way of relating with the divinity through nature, for example. And so, ang approach, sabi nga, ito, natutuwa ako, lumilitaw itong mga ganito. Sabi, siguro magkakasundo tayo, magtatagpo tayo pag pinag-usapan climate change, ecology, the air, water, pollution, the rivers and the seas, the plants and the animals. Kasi dito yan ang Laudato Si. Ito, translation ko sa likod. That's my translation from the original Italian. Yung Laudato Si ni St. Francis of Assisi, yung Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. Kaya siguro, pwede natin maggamit ngayon. Take off from Pope Francis kasi he's following St. Francis of Assisi. Dito, may mga new directions na. Let's take advantage in the reformulation of our discourse. Let's take advantage of the growing new understanding of being church. Ngayon, dati, puro parokya lang eh. Meron pang BEC, merong transparochial, merong international networks, new view of evangelization and cultures. So ngayon, at least napag-aaralan na yung kultura, enculturation, new way of doing mission. Iba na ngayon ang pagtuturo ng missiology, dialogue of faith and life. So sa mga disasters, sa mga vaccine, by the way, the pandemic also becomes a platform for realizing that we are saved not alone but together. Indigenous movements. Now, I'd like to highlight this. No, it's not enough, I think, to just keep on limiting pastoral ministry to small communities, because there are movements, local and international. Like for example, the United Nations. Kailangan may maglalabi dyan. Hindi pwedeng lahat nandoon sa tabi ng ilog. Merong mga lobbying of the rights of the indigenous peoples inside the Bangsamoro. And they have to go to Congress, to the Senate, and deal with the different power brokers. So we need to support social movements as well. And the peace and reconciliation movements, environmental movements, climate change response. And lastly, I'd like to inform you that I've started a research on Bishop Claver. I think he holds a key, no? Kasi he is talagang full-blooded Igorot. And he was a very good theologian, applied theologian, and a bishop, a man of the church. Ngayon, because here, during the pandemic, when I was doing gardening, I was cutting bamboo, and I discovered that in our mini forest, there is this structure of a stone bridge with a canal and a waterway system. And who did that? Bishop Claver. When he was assigned here to studying in Ateneo, he applied his bontok skills in tuping. So ngayon, kinunang kong litrato, inside the mini forest, hidden under dry leaves and the forest grove, is this amphitheater na yung makita niyo yung mga bato, walang simento, and he did that single-handedly. And now I want to understand this, and I'm trying to connect this stone bridge construction with his idea of the waterways and engineering and Bontok spirituality, and eventually political spirituality in this popular culture. I don't know where this will lead me, but I call this the unsilent stones of Bishop Francisco Funay Claver. If somebody there could help me, please. And I think the one last sentence, siguro, one real key here in the combination of the discourses would be the Christianized indigenous person community, because they hold attention within them, but I think the creativity should also flow from them. So thank you very much.
Maraming salamat, paring Bert. So now we move to the second part of this conversation, the conversation among the panelists themselves. No? So as Miss Vicky has mentioned, this is also an interfaith dialogue, no? Because we have representative from the Catholic Church, from the UCCP and the Anglican Church. So anybody of you who has a question or a comment about the other's presentation?
I have a question to ask from the priests, the pastors. I'm quite excited with this idea of indigenizing or Filipinizing the theology, because I think that's really a key step that needs to be done. So we will veer away from the traditional, kinds of prayers and rituals that we have, and see how to integrate also those other rituals. So a certain degree, I saw that, like for instance, in the Anglican Church, kapag Thanksgiving, yung ganyan, syempre yung i-offer ay yung mga products ng mga indigenous, dadalhin nila dyan, ganyan. So parang merong, tapos yung mga songs na yung nailagay na sa Lidumay tunes, ganyan. Tapos syempre yung sa mga places where the language is only Igorot, they also have an Igorot mass and Igorot sermons and all that. But I think those are more the forms, no? The substance is the more difficult one. So I think I would like to know, meron ba talagang possibility to have that sort of change? And is there an active movement within the church for priests and pastors to really develop that kind of the process of Filipinization?
Okay. And may I add to that, when is enculturation cultural misappropriation, and when is it a valid way to retrieve the wisdom of the idols? Father Albert, you want to respond?
Oh yes. Well, isa sa mga pioneer dyan sila Joe de Mesa talaga. No? As a matter of fact, yung mga apologies, na pick up ko yun sa sa isang presentation niya. At kaya nga nung humarap ako dun sa mga bishops, sinabi ko, actually marami na nag-sorry. Baka kayo na lang nahuhuli. So, importante may mga pioneer. Pakinggan ka man o hindi, basta tuloy lang.
Oh, exactly.
O ganon, tuloy lang. Pero at the same time, ang isang trap dito, yung bang indigenizing, parang if you make it a project, so parang ang nangyayari, ang project mo na ay magkaroon ka ng sarili mong teorya, imbis na harapin mo talaga yung totoo. Di ba? So, parang na-box na. Halimbawa, yung pag sinabing, dapat postcolonial. Pero that can be useful, pero ano yun eh, pero ang framework mo, you're just veering away from the colonial rather than yung allowing the seed to grow. Malay mo, hindi post-colonial lang lalabas. Iba. Oo. So yung iba, ang nangyayari, mas puro negative.
The rough ground of praxis.
Oo. Yung iba naman, nativist, na I will have nothing to do with the West. Pero mahirap din yun eh. Kasi saan mo ipipresent yan? Sa International Congress? Hihingi ka pa rin ng pamasahe. Tapos ipapublish mo pa rin sa abroad para meron kang legitimacy. O di rin sa akin, harapin na lang natin. Halimbawa, nung sa akin yung loob, kung ano yung makakatulong sa lawikain, pag-usap ko sa tribo, at saka yung filosofiya ni Paul Ricoeur, ni Joe de Mesa, ni Salazar, kung ano yung makakatulong, basta hinaharap ko yung totoong problematic. Yun.
I think yung isang process siguro, kasi marami namang common values, di ba, and ethics between Christianity and indigenous worldviews. So yung common values na yun ang isang pwedeng pag-umpisahan. Kasi paano natin i-reinforce yun, yung values of reciprocity, of being in solidarity with nature, yung mga ganyan. Paano natin i-ensure na that really becomes embedded doon sa ano, and people who go to church and children will learn those, kasi that's how we learn everything, di ba? Mula bata tayo, tinuturuan tayo ng parents natin ng kung ano dapat ang isang mabuting tao, ganyan. And I remember, kaya ako maski na ganyan yung father ko, dahil nga very good people naman sila and they understood what we were fighting for, in the end parang we came together and agreed na tama naman, dapat talaga ganon, di ba? So ano ang siguro ganon, maghanap ng common ground and build upon that, and work together for further how do you call, further spreading this further, kasi ang dami-dami ng masasamang ugali at
Yung ano, nung minsan nagbigay ako ng retreat sa mga kaparian dyan sa Baguio. Nagulat ako sa sharing. Talagang lalim ng angst. Lalim ng angst na hindi pa paring Bart, dapat pagpari na tayo eh. Dapat iwanan na yung ibang mga ritual dyan. May mga ganon. Ang daming angst.
I can imagine. I have seen that.
You've seen that,
I lived through that. So
that's right. So,
like that, yeah.
Anyway, dapat harapin natin yon.
Now, from my work, and I did work with Protestant congregations in Apur Abra among the Tingians there, and also with the Roman Catholic parish. In fact, I saw at least two approaches. One ay yung pari doon talagang siyang may initiative sa indigenization ng misa eh. Talagang napaka-active, marami na siyang recordings, especially yung music ng mga Tingians. The other one is among Protestants doon sa Buklok area, Bulini, Budabusa, sabi sa Apur Abra. Congregations mismo ang parang initiative, kasi marami sa kanila talaga mga sila din yung elders doon sa lugar, and they're basically the performers of all these rituals, and they're trying to bring this in to their worship. But of course they're always looking for that again conversation between their tradition and their Christian tradition. So they're basically in that location, no? Now of course there are some mga mas bold na they're starting basically from their own stories, because they do ritual from their own stories, and their stories actually is also very much yung sinabi ni Ate Vicky, nakikipag-ulayaw talaga yan sa ating tradisyon bilang Kristiyano. And so therefore you perform the ritual with that story, and at the same time magandang tingnan yon, because yun nga ang pinakabalon ng teolohiya nila, no? Or at least the way they look at life. And gaya ng sinabi natin, medyo mas friendly pa nga ito sa ating pangangailangan ngayon, especially
Can you give
climate emergency, right?
The example?
Ang protestante kasi mas medyo libre, ano? Wala tayong mga liturgical canons ganun eh. Doon sa protestante kasi parang especially if you're influenced by the free church tradition, mga low church traditions, medyo you can be very innovative in your worship. And your primary resource is your tradition. So not only that, they sing the Saldumay, they also pray actually their prayers, but simple yung pangalan lang ng syempre Jehovah, ginagamit pa lang yun, yung mga no longer but there are mga iba doon, they're trying to reconcile even the kabunyan, the concept of kabunyan, and that of yung God talk in the Christian tradition. May mga gumagaw rin ng ganon, no? And at the same time, even there dun sa Eucharistia, no, sa aming mga Protestante, we are not bound to sa Eucharistia naman, even yung mismong narration of the faith, no? Parang nandun yung parang yung genius din ng sinasabi nating passion sa mga Tagalog, na kung saan yung story ng Biblia nagiging story nila, no? So yung parang you can see the correspondence between their tradition and that of their Christian tradition. And in the process creating some ritual performances that can be accepted in that local parish. And there are several parishes doing that.
Yeah. There are 2 hands raised.
Okay. We can actually end the moderated conversation, and we can give the floor to Miss Mai to give the audience a chance to raise their questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Agnes and the rest of the panelists. Now is the time for us to ask the questions coming from the audience. So we have a lot of questions here, but we have limited time, so kukuha na lang tayo ng mga ilang question. These questions coming from Miss Carolina Dionco. To all the speakers, but especially to Father Bert Alejo, thank you for mentioning Pope John Paul II's apology to the indigenous people. So it reminds me of his 1992 message to the Latin American bishops on the 500th anniversary of Columbus' journey to the Americas. The Pope thanked for God for planting the church and with the coming of the gospel. He also mentioned about the abuses committed by some missionaries and unscrupulous colonizers. What I find problematic in these apologies is the violence and abuses are unfortunate yet justified, for it resulted in Christianizing the native population. Now, do you see this as a problem too, so that maybe the apology could be different this time? Or as Dr. Anna said, they misinterpreted the gospel. So did they really misinterpret it? Thank you.
Well, yung mga binabanggit, halimbawa, yung katulad binabanggit ni Cardinal Vidal na meron mga abuse, may mga sexual harassment pa rin eh. Pero sa totoo lang, nangyayari pa rin ngayon yun eh. Kahit na mga Pilipino na yung pare. Ano? So, nakita ko nga, kaya nga may confession sa church. Kasi built-in talaga may mga, may mga kapalpakan. So, nagsa-self-correcting and perpetually humiliated and humbled ang simbahan. Pero if we just rely on our own capacity, wala na eh. Dapat na-decimate na itong mga simbahan eh. Di ba? I mean, sa dami ng kapalpakan ng mga ministro at gano'n. Sa bagay, yung pinili nga, handpick ni Jesus, 12, palpak pa rin eh. Yung isa, nag-suicide. Yung isa, nagtaksil. Yung karamihan, tumakbo nung naduwag. Mga babae na lang naiwan sa paanan ng krus. Isasabihin siguro ni Jesus, ay nako, hanggang kailan ako magtitiis dito? So in other words, it's partly colonization, but at the same time, partly human nature. It also happens in other religions. I was just reading yung mga sexual harassment sa Buddhism, sa ganyan, ano? Sa mga sangha. So we just have to face. Kaya nga maganda rin yung pag-aaral ng anthropology para nakikita natin na these cultures are experiments of being human in different ways and different places. So we affirm the virtue, we denounce and regret, but it does not justify colonialism.
I'd like to add a little to that. Yung yung tingin ko, kasi of course, even among indigenous peoples, as meron din mga ganyang mga violations. Kaya sa akin, very crucial talaga yung education din on human rights. Diba? Kasi if you are able to educate people that they have the right not to be violated, may right sila to, all these human rights that are for them, yung rights of women, yung ganyan. Kailangan talagang ma-educate ang people about that at saka ang community. So even in the parishes, that should really be part of the education. Kasi if you have people who are aware that they have the right not to be violated, they have the right not to, and they are able to come together to speak up, that is what will change the picture. It's really people rising up, not fearing because they are the only ones, and coming together with the support of those who believe that those rights should be protected. No, that's the way that things will come about, and kaya part of yung Christian education really is integrated talaga yung basic respect for all human rights.
I can also cite at least 2 churches that did their mea culpas, yung United Church of Canada and the United Church
Oo,
of
tama.
Australia na may kulpas nila is in the preamble even of their charters, na respective charters. And at the same time, that's coupled with these new theological constructs. Na meron na mga rainbow serpent theology, which is actually like official in some sections of the church. And so, ibig sabihin, it's not only the mea culpa statement, nasabi naman ni Apo Bert yun, but also these theological explorations that will celebrate indigenous spiritualities and traditions.
So thank you so much for your answers, dear panelists. Would you like to add some more?
I'd like to add lang, siguro there's something we can also pick up from indigenous communities, yung duties naman.
Oo.
Kasi may pagka heavily Western yung human rights. Sa atin, duty. Halimbawa, pag tutulong ako para mapaaral yung bunso kong kapatid, hindi naman niya right yun. Pero I feel obliged, di ba, to help. May malakas din sense of duty. Sabi ng isang si Dato Al Saliling ng Eromanon Manobo. Paring Bert, meron din kaming human rights teaching. Mas nauna pa nga kami sa Universal Declaration of Human Rights sa tribo. Pero sa amin, our rights are not asserted like the way you protest. Pag nakita namin na yung bata umiiyak dahil ng gugutom, papakainin na namin yan. Hindi na siya kailangan magprotesta. Kasi may sense ng duty ako na tulungan naman yung bata. Kaya sabi, we have to cultivate that also. Siguro kailangan Boy Scout, no? On my honor, I'll do my best to do my duty to God and my country. So, kuminsan naman, criticism naman ng Universal Declaration of Human Rights, bakit daw walang Universal Declaration of Human Duties? I think reciprocal naman yan. Kailangan lang i-highlight din.
Sa amin kasi, if sa amin for halimbawa, yung worth mo as a person usually measured yan in terms of what you have done for the orphans, the widows. Kaya kapag may na-orphan halimbawa sa community namin, pinag-uusapan talaga sino ang pwedeng mag-adapt dyan at tumulong. Ganyan. Parang that's really parang inherent yan na your worth and in the end, kasi alam mo meron kaming practice ng bayao, di ba? Pag may namatay, maski sino pupunta magsasalita about how good or bad that person is. Ngayon, kapag talagang yung bad, sasabihin nila talaga. Kaya kapag ang sama mo sasabihin nila, sige, ganyan kapag binayao, kapag namatay ka, mahiyang-hiya ang mga kamag-anak mo. Ganyan, di ang laki pressure yun eh.
Pwede ka rin debatehin nung iba.
So it's really a continuum, di ba? Na talagang yung ganyang obligation mo, yung duty mo, ganyan. Tapos yung human rights, nag-evolve naman yan kasi yung mga states are the main violators of human rights, di ba? Na supposed to be sila ang nagpro-protect ng citizens nila, hindi naman nila ginagawa. Kaya sila ang main duty bearers. Pero for people, it's really people have, they feel that they are obliged to do that simply because that is how they were raised and that is how they were brought up.
And I think we need to really take this very seriously, yung pag-protect sa mga indigenous communities. Kasi sa pangkalahatan, sinasabi ko na kanina to, we're talking about their spirituality is most friendly to the earth, no? So it's good to re-examine that, to revisit that, even reread our tradition, Christian tradition, through their eyes or lenses. Kasi baka ako ma-rediscover natin ng scripture because I saw some questions dun sa chat, sa Q&A about that, no? Trying to reread the scripture using the lenses of the indigenous peoples, and we may actually discover something that's hidden from us dun sa ating official.
Alright. So thank you. Sobrang rich po ng discussion natin. Actually, ang dami pong questions na nandito sa Q&A natin. But we have to be mindful of the time. Isa lang sigurong comment yung gusto kong basahin coming from Brother Dennis Erasca. So comment that the panelists may respond to. Based on what I've already heard in the presentations, I believe that the language of and conceptual tools used and deployed in the dialogues between the church, the IPs, and their go-betweens already. But the attitude of most of the leading persona is one of the wanting, blocking, harvesting. the even and the lower codes. So very inspiring talk and conversations this morning. Thank you so much, Dr. Ano, Dr. Corpus, and Father Bert Alejo for your wonderful insights. We would like to go further, but we are bound in time, and we still have the afternoon session. So with this, we'd like to proceed now to the presentation of certificates. So we are very much thankful for the insights and the time you rendered. So with this, I'd like to present a certificate of appreciation. Let me read. The Theology and Religious Education Department of De La Salle University, Manila, and the Religious Educators Association of the Philippines present the Certificate of Appreciation to Ferdinand Ano for his invaluable contribution as resource speaker in the roundtable panel discussion series entitled Postcolonial Christianities in the Philippines, 500 Years and Beyond, on the topic Indigenous Practices and Religion, held on May 29, 2021, 10 o'clock to 12 p.m. via Zoom and Facebook live streaming. Signed by Dr. Fides Del Castillo, the Chair of the Theology and Religious Education Department of the LSU, and Mr. Rayuel Rito Senyo, the President of the Religious Educators Association of the Philippines. A round of applause for Dr. Ano. Thank you.
Maraming salamat po.
Salamat. The same certificate is given to Victoria Tuuli Corpus for her invaluable contribution as resource speaker in the roundtable panel discussion series entitled Postcolonial Christianities on topic of Indigenous Practices and Religion. Signed by Dr. Fides Del Castillo and Mr. Rayuel Rita Senyo. Salamat po.
Maraming salamat.
And the same certificate of appreciation given to Father Albert Alejo from the Society of Jesus for his invaluable contribution as resource speaker in the roundtable panel discussion series entitled Postcolonial Christianities in the Philippines, 500 Years and Beyond. So this was signed by Dr. Fides Del Castillo, the Chair of Theology and Religious Education Department, and as well as Mr. Rayuel Rito Senyo. Thank you po. Maraming salamat po. Salamat po, Father Alejo. So, muli, maraming salamat po sa inyo lahat. Marami pong mga insights, marami po tayong natutunan, at marami pa rin po tayong mga katanungan, hindi pa po nasasagot. So, pero kailangan na po nating magtapos sa ngayon dahil meron pa po tayong roundtable discussion this afternoon. Kailangan po nating magpahinga at kumain ng tanghalian. So don't forget to log in at the same Zoom link in your flash on your FB page. No? And then you can also see this in the theology page. No? And then may I invite also the people, the audience, to participate in the evaluation. So for us to know your feedback, your concerns and insights as well. So might as well fill this out and send back to the respective email. So with this, once again, maraming salamat po sa inyong pakikiisa. Maraming salamat sa inyong oras at sana ay may mga natutunan tayo at nakadagdag ng kaalaman para sa topic na Indigenous Practices and Religion. So with this, good afternoon everyone and thank you. Salamat.
Salamat po ng marami.
Thank you po.
Maraming salamat po.
The future is indigenous.
So much po.
And I mean it. I mean it. Salamat po.
Thank you. Maraming salamat. Buti nakabalik si paring Bert. Salamat po, Dr. Ano. Thank you po.
Recording stopped.
Dr. Vicky.
Ayan.
Congratulations.
Salamat po.
Congratulations. Maraming salamat.
Ang daming questions.
Oo, sana magkaroon tayo ng enough na time mamaya Meron pong request si Reverend Terry, parang nagkaroon siya ng power interruption last time. So nag-recording na lang siya. I'm gonna share it with the technical panel.